All right. Good morning, folks, and welcome to Friday Chalk Talk. My name is Martin, and I'm joined here today by my bioethicist colleague, Clint Moore from Advocate in Illinois. And today we've got installment number 3 of our medical ethics case discussion. Like always, out of respect for patient privacy, today's case is a hypothetical one, but based on some real past experiences. And our format for today is to review a case, add a little bit of a wrinkle for version 2. I'll talk for just a few minutes about some of the legal considerations I might have when I'm approaching it. Clint will do the same, but from an ethical perspective, and then we'll open it up for discussion for everybody. So we have the case of Jane Doe, and she is a 75-year-old woman who never sought medical care and really with an unknown medical history. Never married, no kids, no contacts. Parents and siblings are all deceased, and she never created an advance directive. Lives alone, completely independent. Neighbors don't even really know who she is. And Jane comes to the hospital after she had an unwitnessed cardiac arrest in the community with bystander CPR. And after 2 weeks in the intensive care unit, it became increasingly evident that she had sustained some really devastating neurologic injury. And really that was the result of anoxia from being down for an unknown amount of time before CPR was started. And so JD required mechanical ventilation and dialysis. She was not brain dead. And on neurologic exam, she was able to withdraw away from pain, but really did not follow any commands. Our neurologic team predicted that really meaningful recovery was not expected. She was going to need a long-term ventilator facility with a trach and a peg, completely dependent upon others, would never be able to make her own decisions, and not even be able to communicate. And in cases like these, palliative care is often consulted to help clarify goals of care. And so what can we do to help an ICU team that's really in distress, to try to help define goals when there's no patient to talk with, no surrogate, not even an advance directive to reference? And I think it's interesting to consider Jane's exact same case, but with one wrinkle. Give her a robust past medical history and see if that addition changes our opinion about our role or our recommendations for her. So this version of Jane, now instead, she's well established within our healthcare organization. She's got decades of medical records, and her past history includes diabetes, that's well controlled, coronary artery disease, again, well controlled, but always refusing invasive interventions like a cardiac cath or bypass or stenting. And she has a history of having had a bowel perforation that she was treated conservatively with IV antibiotics and TPN in time, again, refusal for anything invasive with some unexpected recovery. So before I hand the mic over to Clint, just a few thoughts that I have on this case. From my viewpoint, as a palliative care physician, not a lawyer, and what legal considerations I'm thinking about is I'm providing a consultation in cases about end of life for those that really are incapacitated and unrepresented. So the US Supreme Court determined in Nancy Cruzan from 1990 that each state gets to set their own standards for these end of life decisions for their incapacitated. And so this case of Jane Doe, it may have a different approach depending upon where you practice. And so it's important to be aware of your state's and sometimes your region's case law. And in the upper Midwest region, I'm aware of at least 3 major Supreme Court cases that hold precedence here in Wisconsin. And those are Cruzan, LW, and Edna, MF. The case law in this region asks us as a healthcare team to start a case like this with the presumption that the right action is preservation of life and the sanctity of life. And you work outward from that starting point. And the reason why we start there from a legal standpoint is that preservation of life is a state interest for its citizens. which is exactly what we saw happen in Jane's case, right? She spent a few weeks in the ICU getting life-prolonging treatment in her best interest to give us time to gather more information. And it, I think, logically makes sense that the default for someone's best interest when goals are unknown is life prolongation, because that gives you time to gather more information and make changes later, whereas the opposite is not true. And so how strong of a case you need to build in order to change the plan from that preservation of life to withdrawal of life support, it varies by state. And let me give you 2 examples of how different this could potentially be. So the Supreme Court of Missouri in Nancy Cruzan set a really high burden of proof needed to withdraw life support, which resulted in Nancy Cruzan's parents' first request to remove artificial nutrition and hydration to be denied. And if we were to use an analogy like a scale with arguments for preservation of life on one side and arguments for withdrawal of life support on the other, then in Missouri, withdrawal of life support in the courts would be permitted if almost every single argument was on one side, and that side literally hit the ground. Compare that to this excerpt from the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, taken where Wisconsin compares itself to Missouri, which says, and I love this excerpt, relatively few individuals provide explicit written or oral instructions concerning their treatment preferences should they become incompetent. The reasons for this are undoubtedly myriad: ignorance, superstition, carelessness, sloth, procrastination, or the simple refusal to believe it could happen to oneself. And this failure to act is not a decision to accept all treatment, nor should society's increasing ability to prolong the dying process make it one. To adopt the clear and convincing standard, which is referencing the state of Missouri, would doom many individuals to a prolonged vegetative state, sustained in a life form by unwanted, perhaps detrimental means that are contrary to the person's best interest. And so Wisconsin courts, as well as some other states here in our region, instead ask for a preponderance of evidence. And so if we use the scale analogy again, a preponderance is when most of the arguments should convincingly be on one side of the scale, not necessarily overwhelmingly hit the ground. Now, that's not a black and white definition, and so that's up for debate about how much preponderance is. My final thought is the way I start a consultation like this with Jane Doe, with absolutely no surrogate, no known obvious wishes, is digging into the person's history. Usually it's decades of notes in the chart. Try to build a case based on some past actions or past documented conversations, trying to show with a preponderance of evidence of what this person would value, right? Trying to create a voice for a patient who doesn't have one, trying to help out our team that is consulting us. And sometimes we'll review that with our ethics team.
Thanks, Martin. Appreciate it. So I'm going to work backwards a little bit and just set up some frameworks, perhaps for discussion from an ethical perspective. So in case number 2, with the addition of this wonderful medical history that the doctors have access to, it's much easier to think about substituted judgment for this patient. So a substituted judgment is, even if there is no family, even if the patient's unable to articulate their goals, we seem to have a picture of what this patient did and did not want. She wanted conservative treatment, nothing invasive. Obviously, we've already done invasive procedures, but we could appropriately withdraw those if we think that substituted judgment pointed us in that way. The first case is more challenging because you don't have any of that history. So substituted judgment really gives way to best interests, because then it's the responsibility of the medical team. And maybe we could talk about this a little bit. I think it's the responsibility of the medical team from an ethical perspective to think about sanctity of life in a number of ways. So when someone says life is sacred, my question would be, so what does that mean? You could certainly say it means that we should preserve it at all costs. Fine, that's one definition. On the other end of the spectrum, you could say life is so sacred, we should not do things to diminish the gift of life or the opportunities to participate in that life beyond just being biologically alive. So I think it's one of the things that I always do when people start bringing up terms is, what do you mean by that? What does it mean for you? Someone says, well, quality of life is more important. Wonderful. Tell me what quality is for you. I mean, is it the grandkids? Is it riding your bicycle? Is it just knowing that your heart is beating in some body at a skilled nursing facility? What's quality of life for you? So that's, my just a sort of an overview of some of the ethical things that I would come up with, Martin, and I'd be happy to hear what other people have to say.
Thank you, Clint. So let's open it up for discussion.
This is Sue. A lot of times we go through this a lot with a lot of patients, and a lot of times what we talk about, like what Clint said with quality of life, is really getting to the perception of the patient's quality of life versus the perception of the person making that decision or their POA. And that brings a lot of discussion with really what is the patient's wishes versus your own wishes.
Clint, I'm curious what, in that first case where we had absolutely no one to talk to, nothing to base anything off of, how do we define terms like sanctity of life? Or does that just fall back to legal definitions from the courts?
Well, you can certainly do that. You could say, we're going to call legal on this, and legal's going to give you a legal answer to a medical question. It's nothing against attorneys. That's just the way they think. I mean, it's sort of like asking a physician for an opinion on case law. Well, that's a medical opinion on a statute. So fair enough. I think one of the things that I always, and this is certainly, it's not in the case law yet. I doubt it ever will be. But one of the mantras that I always remember, and I can't think that I'm was bright enough to actually come up with this. I think I probably learned it from somebody. But are we, in whatever situation, let's say case number one where we have no medical history, are we actually doing things for the patient, or are we doing things to them? And that someone could say, well, why can't we just get a guardian? You sure can. You can call legal and you can present them with this case, and they can say sure, and everybody will get their dark suits out of the cleaners, go to court. The hospital will spend $5,000 to $7,000, and there'll be a guardian, and then you're still left with a guardian who doesn't know the patient, a physician who does know the patient, who might say, well, now that we have someone, I'm going to work with them on withdrawing support because I never thought this was appropriate in the first place. And most states' guardians will say, whoa. No. That, I'm in place now. We're going to keep this person alive because that's what the court hired me to do. Sanctity of life. So now and I'm not saying never do that, but I think from an ethical perspective, just falling back on a guardian can in many situations just make the situation worse.
Clint, what do you do? So we've had this situation a lot. We've talked about in our ethics meetings. So you've got a patient in this situation. How do you not get a guardian? How do you move forward with a decision without basically what I would call legal representation? Because we've been able to find family members, somehow, somebody had a family member they hadn't talked to in 10 years, but we found them. Another one had a senior services person that they had designated somehow, and then we actually found family for them. We have only had one patient where we could not actually find family. So how do you not legally put a guardian, as a safety gap kind of thing?
Yeah, I think if the situation is that the patient is fairly stable on all of the interventions that you have in place, you're probably going to be hard pressed not to get a guardian.
Sure.
Because one, utilization review is going to be on your case saying, what are we doing? Your patient's vented, pegged, ready to go. Let's get a discharge plan. I would not disagree with that. What I would challenge is the patient who is not stable on, let's say that they become significantly hypotensive and they're now on 3 pressors, dialysis is intermittent, or there might need to be a shift to CVVH, which no nursing homes do. I think at that point, the team along with nephrology could say, we're not going to do that because it's not in the patient's best interest to tie them to a procedure that, one, keeps them in the hospital. I mean, I don't know about Wisconsin, but there's nowhere outside the hospital that you can have a patient on continuous dialysis. So I think at that point, you could say, either we're not going to do CVVH or we're not going to increase pressors, or both. And the patient would probably die from withholding non-beneficial treatment. And that's where the documentation becomes so important, that physicians and healthcare teams are not required. I can't think of any statute that says you physician, you nurse, you consultant, you're required to provide non-beneficial treatment. And now that's open for interpretation as to what non-beneficial is. But I would say if the person's on dialysis and they start crashing and nephrology says, I don't really want to do this, I think then we're crossing the line in terms of doing something to the patient instead of for them. And that's what you bring up. I think you could turn it off. Yeah.
Yep. I think you bring up a good point, how we keep offering services that aren't beneficial, but because it's something that's on the table. A good example is with COVID lung transplants. And it's like, we know people aren't, but we bring it up, and it's, just delays the inevitable.
Yeah, you're right. And again, I think it's, I think many healthcare teams and hospitals, especially in the Midwest, which happens to be a very litigious area, find that as a safe way to stay out of the courts. Let's just keep doing stuff. I'll never get sued for doing more stuff, which is not true. I mean, I testified, or gave a deposition as an expert witness for a case at University of Chicago, where it was exactly that. There was a family, the family kept saying, do this, do this, do this. The physician said, no, no, no. And then finally did it. The patient died because of the procedure. The patient was going to die anyway, but died because of the procedure. The family successfully sued the physician saying, yeah, we might have requested it, but we're not doctors.
Oh my gosh.
And the judge said to the physician, you should have just said no. If you had just said no and we were back here in this case, the ruling would have been in your favor. So I don't want healthcare teams to think that doing stuff ad nauseum somehow buys them legal protection. It does not. You're the physician, you're the nurse, you're the advanced practice person, you're the consultant. You have to determine whether this is a beneficial treatment or it imposes more significant harm. And if it does, you have the opportunity to say, I'm not going to do that. Now, the family may want to transfer to hospital X. Well, then fine. That should not then require you to do that, though.
Right. Let me say hello. My name is Dave Tannenbaum. I'm with the Ascension Club St. Mary's. Hi. Did want to ask a question. I observed that we used to often use the word futile. We're not going to do this. It's futile, futile, futile. And now I'm in a world where no one uses the word futile. And the words are medically indicated, or not medically indicated. And I wasn't sure whether this is unique to my organization or is this something that's commonly experienced by others? And what's the basis of it? What does it buy you and what does it get to frame things in terms of indicated versus futile, not futile?
Well, I'll let Martin talk about the from a physician perspective, but from an ethical perspective, I always found the term futility to be, or futile care to be a rather arrogant statement, because it presumes that, let's say it's a physician, on his or her own has determined that this is not worth it. And that, I think that's what gets futility a sort of a bad name. There's a lot of literature out there, beginning with there's a Texas has a futility statute, which allows Texas to say, this is futile. You have 10 days to find another hospital or we will withdraw support. And they do it. And it's been upheld by the Texas Supreme Court multiple times. I think that the thing I go back to is, what is a healthcare team's responsibility? Their best interest is to do good for the patient. Okay. So beneficence. Non-maleficence is to do no harm. So if we go back to those two of those core principles and you evaluate your interventions based on that, are your interventions benefiting your patient? Sure. Yes, they are. Yes, despite the burden, I think the benefit is greater. Fine, continue it. If your treatment provides really no benefit beyond just preservation of biological life and imposes a significant harm, then why are you doing it? So that's where I think the non-beneficial and beneficial or non-indicated, I think non-beneficial is actually more powerful than not indicated. And I always advise, if a patient's asking me how to document, if they come up with futile, I'd say, before you type that in, before you save that note, erase futile and put non-beneficial and imposes a significant harm on the patient. That's going to be far more powerful. If you wind up in court, which if you have a white coat or a gray coat or whatever coat you have, or no coat at all, you're going to wind up in court one day. That's just part of welcome to America. But I think the futility argument started because physicians felt compelled to do everything. The futility argument said, well, no, you don't really need to. Lawrence Schneiderman wrote a book with, I think, I want to say her name was Nancy Kellerman, but I'm sure I'm wrong on the last name. Just Say No, on medical futility. I think in the last number of years, perhaps last decade, most of the literature has moved away from futility and toward non-beneficial and harmful, because you see, you have both responsibilities, not just one. You're supposed to provide treatment that's beneficial and not as the least amount of harm that you can do. So if your benefit is here and your harm is there, I'm going to ask you as an ethicist, why are you doing it? Now, if you want to classify that as futile, that's fine. If I'm working at your hospital, I would certainly tell you that non-beneficial and harmful is far more powerful in documentation than futility.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you, David, for the question as well. I'm going to throw my 2 cents in there, Clint, and what I'm thinking about. My personal issue with the term futility is that I think it's too general of a term. Some physicians write that when they think that somebody's quality of life is insufficient or they're suffering, and there's assumptions and presumptions made. Some physicians use the word futility because they don't think that something will be successful or it's not medically beneficial. And so I'd like the term medically beneficial or medically indicated or whatever you'd like, because it's a more narrow term to me and it's clearer as to what that physician is meaning. Because I think in the perfect world, the doc is the expert on what is medically indicated. The patient is the expert on the patient's values, quality of life, and suffering. And when those two come together, they're sort of the two halves that make a whole. And when one tries to dig into the others, that's when mistakes are made, when people step on landmines. All right. Clint, it's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure's mine. I'm glad we had such a simple case this morning.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Be well. Bye-bye.